Hello, everyone. Is everyone having a good day? Yeah. I feel like we're on a bit of the home stretch here. Thank you for coming out. Love you all. Appreciate you coming to the talk. My name is Mike Pack, and you can follow me on Twitter, GitHub here. I don't really tweet so much anymore, but I've been thinking about tweeting some of the resources that I've used to compose this talk, as well as things that are just related and that I find interesting here. So if you find this talk interesting, certainly follow me on Twitter for some additional reading there. So as I mentioned, my name is Mike. I'm an independent software engineer at the moment, but I do some other work here in the community. I run a conference called Dinosaur.js, and I run a meetup called Full Stack. But I'm not really here to talk too much about that today. I'm here to talk to you guys about time. I'm sure you're maybe curious about what I'll be going into. This is a fairly conceptual talk, fairly abstract talk. But the impetus for this talk is that I've been gaining kind of this realization that software is more like a living being than an inanimate object. And as living beings, software must adapt with time. So it must be malleable, bend, and evolve with time. And I'll talk a bit more about what I mean there. So it must adapt with time, but it's also becoming increasingly important, in my opinion, with sort of the advent of the Internet of Things, which I hate that term, the Internet of Things, because we already have the Internet, and the Internet already has a lot of things. The Internet of Things is really just representative of the Internet of more things. I think we should rename it. It should just be called the Internet of more things. But I digress. The Internet of Things, what it represents, though, is sort of this increase in and the accessibility of commodity hardware that we're able to connect on a network. So I'll be talking a bit about distributed systems, but the real impetus for this is sort of this Internet of Things. Let's see if there's anything else I want to say at that point. I think so. Let me show you this clock that I have here. Sorry, I keep getting hit straight in the eyes with this, so pull this way a little bit. Can people in the back see this, hopefully-ish, kind of? It's not going to work so well if I have to pull it up. What I have here is a clock that is inspired by an old Leonardo da Vinci sketch. At that time, timekeeping was quite poor, and this was an improvement on the timekeeping at that time. So let me just show you how this works. So this is a very basic timekeeping mechanism. Really what we have here is a weight that pulls on a series of pulleys and gears, and effectively moves this clock in a very basic incrementing fashion. This clock, it must not be a replica. I haven't done my research on this, but I don't think it's a replica because certain things, like if I just take this thing off, it just continues to work. I just don't feel like Da Vinci maybe had that sort of inclination towards pure aesthetics. I won't even put that back on. There's no point in me putting that on. So, what I want to show you about this clock, though, the reason I show you this kind of ancient clock, if you will, this is from the 15th century, is because this clock in particular, I'll wind this up again, is quite fallible. It's probably fallible in a lot of obvious ways, But it's fallible, of course, due to some environmental factors. So it's fallible maybe because some of the gears, it's a cheap plastic kind of Chinese model here. But it's fallible maybe because the gears in time tend to degrade or erode. But it's also fallible for environmental reasons too. So if this clock right here, I have 6 quarters in this weight over here, or 8 quarters rather in this weight. If we were to have this identical clock, and we were to have 2 of these identical clocks at sea level, and they were to be calibrated such that it was accurate in terms of its ability to keep time. So it's increments, by that I mean its increments were at a second interval. If 2 of these were built at sea level, they would run approximately at the same time. But if these were brought, one of them was brought to altitude, it would run a bit slower than the one running at sea level. This is because the closer you are to the center of the Earth, the stronger the gravitational pull. And the stronger the gravitational pull, again I'll wind this up a bit, the stronger the gravitational pull, the more that this clock is going to be weighted down. So now we can simulate this a bit by just kind of pulling on this weight here. You can see that the clock moves at a different pace. Similarly, if this has less weight, it'll move at a slower pace. So this clock is inherently fallible, as really are all clocks inherently fallible. So an improvement on this clock for its time about 200 years later was the pendulum. And the pendulum was a dramatic improvement on this. I won't talk about, there's so many things that I wish I could talk about today that I won't have time for, including how the pendulum works and why it's a timekeeping device. But the pendulum was an improvement, but the pendulum is also fallible and inherent to, and has some, it's also beholden to environmental factors as well. So things like heat affect pendulum clocks. So we have improvements on the pendulum clock. We've got things like the quartz clock. And the quartz clock inside has a very small tuning fork shaped quartz resonator, which when supplied with the appropriate amount of voltage, resonates at a specific frequency, and thus we can convert time in the physical world into time in the digital world. And so this is calibrated to resonate at a very specific frequency, and that's the way in which quartz clocks generally work. So a quartz clock was a significant improvement on the pendulum clock, but it's also fallible. Quartz clocks are also beholden to environmental factors as well, things like heat, where if you supply a quartz clock with an insufficient or an overabundance of voltage, that quartz clock, that resonator will resonate at a different frequency. So they are also beholden to environmental factors and other environmental factors as well. So an improvement on the quartz clock was the atomic clock, using a cesium atom. And so this atomic clock was invented somewhere, the quartz clock was invented somewhere in the late 19th century. And this was invented somewhere in the mid 20th century. And this was a dramatic improvement on timekeeping. And this is still the standard for timekeeping for us to this day. We have a cesium clock up in Fort Collins, and you can actually synchronize your watches with that particular atomic clock through radio frequencies. There are yet improvements. The atomic clock is still fallible, and there are yet improvements on the cesium atomic clock. There's the ytterbium atomic clock, which uses an ytterbium atom instead of a cesium atom, and it uses lasers instead of microwaves in order to agitate that atom. This is yet still fallible, and we continue to improve on this. And so, using high-powered lasers, we're able to more accurately measure time in a ytterbium or a cesium. Well, actually, it wouldn't be a cesium, that's a microwave. But in an ytterbium atomic clock, we can use more high-powered lasers to get even more accuracy out of that. But all of these clocks are still fallible. This clock, the atomic clock, will, over the span of about 14 billion years, it will skew by about 1 second. Which is, pretty much as perfect as you can get. But it does still skew. There is still inherent fallibility in an atomic clock. In the same way that just pulling down on this clock, there is inherent fallibility in the gravitational pull on this clock, there's an inherent fallibility in atomic clocks as well. And this, in some ways, stems from the fact that we're trying to approximate physical time, with some type of device that is a creation of our own. It's not a natural device, these are all man-made creations, but the atom is a natural timekeeping device to some extent, so that's why it's so accurate. So clocks are fallible. That's really, I think, the important thing to take away from kind of these first set of slides, is that clocks are fallible. And so you probably know that I'm here today to talk about time, but there's really two different types of kind of discussions that I want to have today. The first of which is something, we just talked about clocks and timekeeping. I want to step away from that for a moment, and I want to talk about physical time and the impact that the passing of physical time, the literal passing of time, has on the work that we do in software. So I want to talk about physical time and its impacts, aside from timekeeping, but just the mere passing of time. And then I want to talk about distributed time. And I want to come back to this idea of fallible clocks. And I want to talk about how distributed systems keep time. So those are the two topics that we're really going to cover today. Let's jump into physical time. So physical time, again, it's the way I want to define this is it's our natural time, the way everyone thinks about time. All of these devices are trying to measure physical time. And this goes back to even the early timekeeping devices like a sundial, for instance. What we're really trying to do is approximate our position in the universe via some device that we've created that is a rough approximation of how the Earth rotates and how the sun, when the sun sets, so on and so forth. This is sort of our own creation. It's not a natural creation. But I'm talking about the natural span of time here. So the title of this talk comes from, the title being Time is the Only Hard Problem in Computer Science, comes from this fairly well understood statement here, which is that there are only two hard things in computer science: cache invalidation and naming things. There's a couple things that bother me about this. I don't, for the record, believe that time is the only hard problem in computer science, in the same way that I don't believe these are the only hard problems in computer science. In fact, these aren't even computer science problems. These are problems of software engineering. These aren't computer science problems. Computer scientists have maybe worked on these problems, but they're really problems of software engineering. So that's the first aspect of this. It's like, these aren't really computer science problems. Computer science problems are, P equals NP and other more mathematically inclined problems. So that's one aspect of this, is that I just think that this is a funny statement. And the other thing about this is that when I read this is a statement that was made in 1996. When I read this, I always thought, like, are those really the only hard problems? Like, how can that possibly be that these are the only hard problems in any field? How can you even state that? So anyway, I continued down that sort of trend and titled this talk, The Only Hard Problem. But nonetheless, I actually believe that these two problems that he's trying to express here are actually functions of time, and that's what makes them difficult, and not so much difficult in and of themselves. So I'll explain what I mean here. But the two things are the cache invalidation and naming things. Let's start with naming things. Why is Phil saying that naming things is a hard problem? I think what he's talking about is kind of 2 points here. The first of which is that when you name something, sometimes it's really easy to name things, and they have some kind of close approximation to the real world. And so we're able to just take whatever it is that we name it in the real world, and we're able to translate that into our code and just name it whatever that is. But a lot of times it's a very abstract concept, and so we don't really have a good sense as to what should I name this if it's a really abstract thing that doesn't have any representation in the real world. So that's one aspect of it. But I think the other aspect is more important, which is that we might name something and it might do something right now when we write this piece of code, when we name this class or this variable something, it might be accurate at that time. But because code needs to be maintained over time by many people, naming is difficult because you sort of need to encapsulate what this thing does now and what it does forever. Otherwise, it'll just be renamed. So naming something is difficult because the code needs to be maintained over time. If we didn't have to maintain that code over time, then I don't think naming would be as challenging. We could work around the whole abstract versus kind of concrete concept here, but it's time, it's the fact that we have to maintain code over time. If we didn't care about maintaining code over time, we could just name it whatever we wanted and be done with it. So that's really naming. I think that's the more simple one of these two examples to understand. This is the way that I'm thinking about physical time. As physical time passes, we need to maintain that code. Cache invalidation is another one, where cache invalidation is a hard problem. This is from a Wikipedia article on cache coherence, which is how CPUs keep caches consistent, like your L caches on your CPU. But really, what caching does, or caching in general, is that we might have some memory resource that does some computation over here, and then we have a cache that sits in between that thing that's doing the computation and the clients that need some information. So maybe a client asks a question like, what is 1 plus 1? Right? Or the memory resource needs to compute the value of 1 plus 1. It does that, it says, okay, that's 2. I'm going to put the value of 2 in that cache. What if the operands change? It goes from 1 plus 1 to 1 plus 2. Now the cache needs to be invalidated, and the cache needs to represent the evaluation of those new operands, and the cache needs to be 3 instead of 2. So the problem, the hard problem that Phil's talking about is that we need to recognize when the operands change from 1 plus 1 to 1 plus 2 in order to know when that cache value needs to change as well. That's the hard problem. It's actually a fairly well understood problem at this point. This is over 20 years later. So, caching is a hard problem. Cache invalidation is a hard problem. But again, it comes to this point that time and the influence that time has on cache invalidation, if we're caching a value and the system doesn't run over any period of time, it's irrelevant whether that cache needs to be invalidated, because those operands wouldn't change from 1 plus 1 to 1 plus 2 if time weren't a factor. It needs time in order to change these operands. So the physical passing of time makes it such that the operands change, which makes it such that cache invalidation is a hard problem. So I just feel like I needed to cover my bases on those two things. I don't think all problems are functions of time. Off by 1 errors is something that people have thrown into this mix. I don't think that's a function of time. And I certainly don't feel that time itself is the only hard problem in computer science. I just felt like it was a good excuse to talk about it. So I want to talk about another example. And this is not my example. This is the renowned computer scientist E.W. Dijkstra's example. One of my favorite computer scientists of all time. He has this quote. It's from one of his most seminal papers, a case against the Goto Statement from 1968. What he says here, forgive me for reading just random off these slides, but he says, my first remark is that, although the programmer's activity ends when he has constructed the correct program, the process taking place under control of his program is the true subject matter of his activity. Give you a minute to just let that sink in for a second. What he's saying here is that there's a difference between the code that you write, the text file, and the program as it runs on a machine in a process. That's what he's saying. He's trying to delineate these two concepts of you write code and you run it on a machine. That's the first part of what he's saying. The second part's a bit longer. Our intellectual powers are rather geared to master static relationships, and that our powers to visualize processes evolving in time are relatively poorly developed. For that reason, we should do our utmost to shorten the conceptual gap between the static program and the dynamic process, to make the correspondence between the program spread out in text space and the process spread out in time as trivial as possible. This is kind of crazy to think about. I found it really difficult to understand what he was saying at first. It took many reads through this essay to understand what he meant. But at first, the first thing to grasp here is that he's delineating between the text file itself and the running program. And he's saying that our ability to reason about that text file is fairly well understood. We can do that. We're experienced enough that we can write code. But what we're not very good at is understanding programs as they run on a machine. And I think this is even the case today. I mean, look at how many frameworks we have on a weekly basis in the JavaScript world. It's an abundance of tools, and all of these tools are how do you model and represent the text space, the code itself. What we don't have a lot of tools for are things like debugging live production systems. We have very poor tools for that. So this is an important concept that I'm going to continue to build on. I'm going to show you an example. Again, the title of his essay was A Case Against the Goto Statement. So I want to look at the Goto Statement, and I want to address specifically what does he mean in more concrete terms, looking at some code. These are these are identical programs. They're very similar in a lot of ways. The left one uses Goto statements, and you have a label at line 3. These are just an infinite loop. This just creates an infinite loop that prints out a monotonically increasing number, meaning it just increments by 1 every time. This program on the left does the same thing as the program on the right, except it uses Goto statements to do its iteration, and the one on the right uses recursion to do its iteration. Dijkstra says the left is bad and the right is okay. Does anyone take a guess, or does anyone know what the difference is? Why is the left unacceptable?
No indentation. It's hard to see where it starts and ends.
Sure, any other guesses? Yeah, shout out.
I bet it has something to do with time.
Yes.
A change in the code base for a reason that kind of was there and just ran away from me. A change in the code base is harder to manage in the Goto case. As the nature of the program changes, you have to find that Goto as opposed to just calling the same function.
Okay. I think there's another reason.
Yeah, I just want to hit on that. In terms of the label code, that name may change in the future. As in on the right, the method call is essentially the same every time.
Okay. Any other? Yeah.
Would the recursion side be run faster than the Goto?
No, the Goto actually goes faster. Yeah.
The recursion side has, it's finite. The Goto side will run indefinitely.
They'll both run indefinitely.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about like resources of the recursion side. No.
Yeah, they're both just infinite loops. So, some people kind of touched on it a bit there, but there's something very concrete here, and it's that the right-hand side, every call to inc, to this function inc, creates a stack frame. With the Goto example, when effectively the CPU sees a Goto statement, it literally jumps to the memory location of what is at line 3 or potentially line 4. So if you're writing something in maybe like JavaScript has Gotos. This is the case in JavaScript, where once it hits that Goto, it nearly just jumps to the memory location to continue its code execution. It does nothing more than that. It leaves no trail or anything behind it, no artifacts of what it did. It just jumps. The right-hand side, in comparison, every time that inc function is called, assuming that we're not using tail call optimization here, every time this inc function is called, it creates a new stack frame. So I want to take a brief look at, well, what is a stack frame? So this is a very basic example of a stack, where the stack starts at the bottom, and a stack is a pretty basic data structure where you kind of push elements in and you pop them off the top. So the main program might have a stack frame, and this is again a very simplified stack frame. Stack frames might have more information than what's here, but at a very basic level it has things like what were the parameters that got passed into me when I was called? What are my local variables? So it has space to store some local variables. And most importantly here in this context is that a stack frame has a return address as well. So that return address is the memory location of where the CPU needs to jump to in order to continue the program. So you can imagine that we have this main, if we come back to this code example here, we've got our sort of main is the entire body of this program on the right. And again, the right is the only one that creates stack frames. Main might be that entire body, where the first call to the inc function might be this stack frame number 1 in kind of a seafoam green. The second call, recursive call, would be stack frame number 2. So if we wanted to determine what was the code path that something took to get to a particular point in this code, we could look at the stack to do that. So let me bring these up again and say, what if the problem here, what he's saying is that we need to think about the passing of time and its influence on our work. What he means in this example here is that, say we use GDB or some way to stop this process, and we stop the program on the left, and it stopped it at line 5. We could introspect into some things about that program. Maybe what is the value of A right now? Maybe it's 1,000. But we don't exactly know how we got to this point in the program. We don't know if we got to A or we got to 5 because it just went from line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or if it went all the way down to hit this Goto statement and then jump back up to line 3 and continue program execution from there. We have no way of knowing how this program got to that particular point in time. Whereas the one on the right, if we use GDB to stop this program in its tracks, so maybe it stops at line 6, we can look at things in the same way that we can look at things over here, like what is the value of A. But we can look at the other important aspect, coming back to this stack here, we can look at the return address. So we can say, well, let me look at the top stack frame, because I know if I'm stopped at a GDB, if I stop this with a GDB, the top stack frame is going to be my context and my function call. So I'm going to look at that stack frame, the topmost stack frame, which will give me the return address of who called me. And that return address will be whoever called whatever function I'm in, the inc function. And then we can look at the return address of that stack frame and follow this all the way back in time to figure out the entire history of this program using stacks. So Dijkstra's argument is, again, that there are some nuances to the code that we write. We need to appreciate the fact that the text file is not exactly the same as the code running on a machine. In fact, in a lot of older languages, the runtime would actually rewrite itself. So we would have, a branch, an entire branch or section of a running program would in real time be updated with a new branching logic, such that if you were to introspect into that process and ask it some kind of existential questions about who are you, how did you get here, what do you know about yourself and things around you, we wouldn't be able to do that with a program that rewrites itself. There would be no history because it's been rewriting itself. Unless it tracks some history like in a log or otherwise, there'd be no history in order to understand how did the program get this way? How did it get to this point? I think this is not just beyond the Internet of Things. When we look at like machine learning, we look at just AI, this context, these stateful systems are being built up. They have a ton of state. Like this state, this represents the state of the program. It contains local variables, parameters, so on and so forth. So it represents the state of the program. When we're building highly stateful systems, they become increasingly difficult to debug if we don't have the right tools, like in this example, a stack frame versus not a stack frame. But imagine you have this giant ML system that's built up lots of context over time, and you stop that process. And you ask it, how are you reasoning this way? How did you get to this point of thinking this way, answering questions this way? And machine learning, sorry, that's what I mean by ML. A lot of ML systems struggle with this. They don't have good tools for figuring this out. And so what you end up doing is having to try and rebuild some of that context manually in order to get an approximation of what it's currently doing to understand its history and how it got to that point. So it's beyond the Internet of Things, it's beyond distributed systems, and it's beyond the context of just a program like this that Dijkstra's talking about. It affects, I think, a lot of areas of the work that we do. So that's really physical time. I hope that this is a concept that I hadn't thought about too much, and so I would imagine it's fairly new to a lot of people in this room, of like, what does it mean to, like, for time to pass, and how does that affect, the software that I'm building? That's physical time. I want to come back to now this concept of fallible clocks. And I want to talk about time in distributed systems. Time in distributed systems is very different than time in the physical world, timekeeping in the physical world. Because clocks are inherently fallible, we can't trust time on any machine in a distributed system. So a distributed system would be 2 or more computers connected on a network. That's sort of what constitutes a distributed system. Those 2 computers, because of things like clock skew and because of the inherent fallibility of clocks, it is almost guaranteed that those 2 computers will have a different time, even with like time synchronization tools that we have today. Those things will be out of sync. Sometimes that doesn't matter in whatever system that we're building. It doesn't matter if they're out of sync. But in instances where we need really precise timekeeping, and there's a certain order in which things need to happen, time becomes really important. But it's because these clocks are fallible that we have distributed time. So distributed time tries to divorce itself entirely from timekeeping in the physical world. So here's an example of distributed time, and it uses what's called a logical clock. So a logical clock divorces itself from physical clocks. And we've got 2 computers here. We've got time along the bottom. This time does not correlate to time in the physical world. It's not saying this is second number 1. It's just saying this is event number 1, or something that happened in that system number 1. So when we look at this, what we can see is that computer A performs some action. We'll call that event 1. It tells computer B in this distributed system that, hey, I performed this event. B confirms that, acknowledges that, creates event number 2. Computer B then performs its own action, creates event number 3, tells A about that. A acknowledges that and says, all right, we're at number 4. Up to this point, what logical clocks are just a means for an agreed upon system for distributed systems to keep time, for multiple computers to keep time. Because clocks are infallible, and if they were to say, what is my local time? Those 2 clocks will inevitably be different times. This might be on the scale of nanoseconds, but this could absolutely be on the scale of minutes. In fact, I have 2 clocks with me that I set at a certain distance apart this morning, and I looked at them now, and they've actually skewed. These are really cheap clocks, but they actually did skew even over the span of between this morning and now. So clocks skew. Because clocks skew, we need something like logical clocks. And that's where the difficulty comes in with logical clocks, is when you have an action that conflicts. So say computer A performs some action and gives it number 5, and computer B performs some action and gives it number 5. And they conflict in some way. And again, there's so much complexity in here, how they can conflict. I won't go into the details of that. But say they conflict in a way that they can't agree upon a resolution that keeps both of their changes. They need to now figure out, well, who wins? So if we have a conflict here, one of us, in order to continue on with this logical clock and continue on with the state of this distributed system, we need to agree upon something. Should we keep computer A's thing, or should we keep computer B's thing? And a lot of times in real distributed systems, like distributed databases, for instance, these logical clocks only get us so far. We can only do so much with a logical clock in a tool like React, or even a tool like Spanner. We can only do so much with logical clocks. We always reach a point, and pretty much every database has the ability for the programmer to write a function that the database will run when it experiences a conflict like this. So the programmer is now responsible for resolving that conflict. But we inherently run into these problems in distributed systems. It's inevitable. So we have a conflict, and now the system needs to resolve this and figure out who wins. So maybe computer B wins, and it says, computer A, I win. Maybe B is a leader in that cluster or something. It says, computer A, I win. Computer A says, I'll acknowledge that was 6, and then I'll tell you that I acknowledge that, and we'll create number 7. Now, there's a lot of clocks, like distributed clocks like this. Some of the earlier ones are from the late 60s, early 70s. They import timestamps. There's vector clocks, which were kind of the next step in that from the React database. We've got things like version vectors and dotted version vectors and matrix clocks, and there's all different types of ways of doing this kind of logical clock, but they're all in the same vein of I have a monotonically increasing number, meaning that it always increments by 1, and it never decrements. Time cannot go backwards. So we have a monotonically increasing clock, and that's what a logical clock is, but they all work more or less the same way, and they all have issues in the same way this one has issues. What a logical clock is concerned about is not so much what time did something happen in this distributed system, like physical time. It cares more about the causality of what happened in that distributed system. So it cares about, well, the causality is that computer A did something first, before computer B did number 3. So 1 happened before 3. That's the causality. What happened, what actually happened in the real world. We want the logical clock to make sure it represents that real world occurrence and the causality of the events that are happening in the real world in our distributed system. So, I want to demonstrate this. So what I'd like to do is get 2 volunteers. All you'll need to do is be able to read an analog clock, and you need to be able to snap your fingers. So I need 2 volunteers. That's all you need to be able to do. Any takers? Yeah? Come on up. This is one I'll give you the right one or the broken one. So, this is Sam.
Snap
I'm
experience.
gonna say, who else knows how to snap? This is super easy. I really won't be quizzing you. That's all, literally all I'm going to ask you to do. Yeah, go on up. So I have. You stand there. Yep. So yours is a bit fast. So I made these clocks such that, and I swear, I set these 5 minutes apart not long ago, and they're about, what, 2 minutes apart? Clock speed is a real thing, especially in cheap commodity hardware. So, his clock, show these to the people, hold them up. They're out of sync clocks. They are deliberately out of sync for the purposes of this demonstration. And Sam's clock is about 2 minutes faster than Cott's clock. So what I want you to do, step a little bit to the side, what I want you to do is I want you to hold your clock out, and I'm going to ask you to snap your fingers, and I want you to remember what time it is on that clock when you snap your fingers, right? So you can snap your finger with one hand, hold the clock out with the other, take a reading of that, and that's all I'm really going to ask you to do, and report the time back. So I'm going to have you, what yours is before, yeah. So I'm going to have you snap your fingers first. And then very briefly after that, a few seconds or so after that, I just want you to snap your fingers as well. And I just want you to take the time and report back what time you did that. So just follow his lead, snap your fingers whenever, and then snap yours a few minutes later. So, seconds, whatever you get.
The whole time.
Well, no, not seconds, just the minute and the hour. Yeah, they're out of sync enough by a few minutes that we don't really need to worry about seconds.
Very
I
quiet.
heard it. No, I heard it. What was your time when you snapped your fingers?
4:07.
Okay. What was your time when you snapped your fingers?
4:14.
4:14.
4:13 and a half.
Okay.
Wait,